how does this go to this?
Oh yeah, I gotta take that.
How does a genre born out of the anti-establishment go mainstream? And what sacrifices did it take to get there? This is the story of how punk bands like Green Day and The Offspring broke the mold and took over the world. It's about how independent record labels hit the jackpot and how West Coast punk kids became Grammy-winning millionaires with Diamond Records. A quick note, this is by no means a definitive history. There are so many important bands I just couldn't cover in the time. Rancid, Bad Religion, Operation Ivy and NoFX to name a few. I've also used pop punk as a catch-all term, but punk, skate punk, street punk and hardcore can all equally apply, depending on who's being talked about. Also, the sources for this video can be found in the bibliography. There is a link in the description. All right, let's get into it. This is the story of the pop punk explosion. The history of punk is well documented. Songs like the Beatles' Helter Skelter, the Kingsmen' Louie Louie, and the Kinks' You Really Got Me can all be described as proto-punk. In America, in the late 60s, garage bands like MC5, the Sonics and the Stooges led the charge, passing the baton to the Ramones. The Ramones in turn inspired British bands like The Damned, the Sex Pistols, and The Clash. In California, home of Black Flag, X and the Dead Kennedys, repeated violence at shows led to the LAPD responding with force, tear-gassing audience members, and beating them with clubs. These bands lay the foundations of what was to come, but if you were in a punk band in the 70s and 80s, you were pretty much guaranteed to be penniless. Despite being highly influential, Black Flag was so poor they lived on a diet of dog food and white bread. By the mid-80s, the original punk scene had become a parody of itself and attracted bad-intentioned audiences solely looking for violence. Faced with such adversity, the early youthful fury of these bands could only last so long. Some began moving in new directions, ushering in post-punk, new wave, and hardcore. In 1985, Rolling Stone wrote, "Primal punk is passé. The best of the American punk rockers have moved on. They have learned how to play their instruments. They have discovered melody, guitar solos, and lyrics that are more than shouted political slogans. Some of them have even discovered the Grateful Dead." Rap music's political urgency outclassed punk's now generic anti-establishment message. Thrash metal also took off as Metallica and Slayer released Kill 'Em All and Rain in Blood, albums that showcased their far superior musicianship. In the 90s, Nirvana's enormous and unexpected success led to a fresh surge of alternative guitar bands going mainstream, as major labels sought the next big thing. But grunge pretty much died out with Kurt, and fans moved on. This next part of our tale begins in 924 Gilman Street, Berkeley, California. In the history of punk, 924 Gilman Street is probably as influential as CBGB's. Established by Maximum Rock and Roll's Tim Yohannan, the all-ages venue located in the Bay Area opened on New Year's Eve 1986. It took its punk credentials seriously. Any group signed to a major label would be barred from playing, known as being 86'd. Its rules included no racism, sexism, transphobia, stage diving, and absolutely no drugs and alcohol. The Bay Area punk scene was a perfect swirling mass of indie labels like Lookout Records, punk zines, and venues. Gilman Street gave punk kids a place to find their community, as well as providing new bands with a ready-made audience. It put on gigs by the short-lived but highly influential Operation Ivy, Rancid, and a new band called Sweet Children, soon to be renamed Green Day. Billy Joe Armstrong and Mike Dirnt met at school in Rodeo, California, and decided to form a band before being joined by drummer Trey Cool in 1990. Still in their teens, they had a formidable work ethic and gigged relentlessly, living in their van, and played hundreds of shows all over the US, mainland Europe, and the UK, getting a lot of heat and growing their fan base. One such fan was Lawrence Hayes, better known by his stage name Larry Livermore, a musician and publisher who had founded the independent record label Lookout Records in 1987. Lookout released Green Day's first two albums, 39 Smooth and Kaplunk, the latter of which sold over 50,000 copies, a major achievement for a tiny label. But the limitations of being on an indie soon became clear as fans struggled to actually get hold of copies. Ambitious and with no plan B to speak of, Green Day wanted to go to the next level. Rob Cavallo, a producer and A&R exec who was just shy of 30 years old when he convinced the band to sign with Reprise Records, a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. The band warmed to him because he was a similar age and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the Beatles. He sealed the deal with a promise to get them a new van to continue touring in, and he'd produce the majority of the band's albums, as well as huge hits by the Goo Goo Dolls, My Chemical Romance, and Dave Matthews Band. But at the time, he was relatively untested and was so focused on making the record a success, he'd repeatedly call up K-Rock using a variety of different voices. "Hey man, play that band Green Day. Those guys are awesome." Of course, signing with a major meant they were ostracized from the community they'd been a part of and branded sellouts. Their song 86 from Insomniac deals with their ban from Gilman Street. In an interview with Spin in 1999, Armstrong said, "I couldn't go back to the punk scene, whether we were the biggest success in the world or the biggest failure. The only thing I could do was get on my bike and go forward." Released in February 1994, Dookie took off slowly, but thanks to heavy rotation of the Longview single on K-Rock, things began to pick up. Basket Case became their first smash hit thanks to its video's popularity on MTV, and the album really took off. By the end of 1994, they'd sold 3.5 million records in the USA alone. Lookout Records benefited too, as Green Day made sure their first 2 albums remained on the indie label until 2005, long after Larry Livermore had moved on. That same year, 1994, The Offspring released their 3rd album, Smash, on Bad Religion guitarist Brett Gerwitz's Epitaph Records. Formed in 1984 by school friends Dexter Holland and Greg Kreisel, who bonded over a shared love of social distortion, they were joined by guitarist Kevin Noodles Wasserman, who was asked to join the group because he was old enough to buy them beer. The band were initially rejected by Epitaph, but Dexter Holland wasn't to be deterred and kept sending Gerwitz their songs. Gerwitz, seeing an improvement, relented and put out their 2nd album, Ignition, which initially sold about 35,000 copies. Epitaph labelled any band that sold 50,000 copies punk rock gold and bought them an ice cream cake to celebrate. But Smash was a different beast. Listening to the tape for the first time on his drive home, Gerwitz circled the block again and again before walking through the front door and announcing to his wife, "Honey, everything's going to be different now."
You gotta keep them separated.
Smash's lead single, Come Out and Play, was another immediate K-Rock favourite, finding a champion in Rodney Bingenheimer, credited as the first DJ to put The Offspring on the radio. When it moved over to heavy circulation on MTV, orders went through the roof. Smelling success, major labels suddenly became interested in punk. Very interested indeed. Brett Gerwitz, still packing orders by hand, found himself in the crazy position of being offered the astronomical sum of $50 million for a 50% stake in Epitaph. He refused. Brett Gerwitz said, "Numbers that big almost had no meaning, but also I just couldn't picture myself doing it. What I did instead was try and hold on to my ethics and my DIY values and my punk rock values, so I took out a loan and started pressing records like crazy." Brett remortgaged his house to meet the demand. By the summer of 1994, Smash was selling over 100,000 copies a week. By the end of the year, it had sold 4 million copies in the US alone. It's now one of the best-selling independent rock albums of all time. Brett Gerwitz: "I'm very proud of 2 things. One is the decision to stay independent. The second thing is the effect of staying independent, the positive effect it had on the independent music community. It really raised the sea level for the indie music business in general." Between them, Green Day and The Offspring had blown the doors off the music industry and brought punk into the mainstream, reaching phenomenal levels of success and paving the way for bands like Blink-182, Sum 41, New Found Glory, Paramore, and Avril Lavigne. The Offspring have sold over 40 million records worldwide, Green Day somewhere over 85 million. The secret to both bands' success is that they just write truly great songs. They nail catchy choruses and melodies and have lyrics that speak to millions of people around the world. And they kept the ethos of the DIY scene that birthed them. Green Day were even voted Best Punk Rock Band of all time by Rolling Stone in 2011, but the elders of the punk scene would still dismiss them. John Lydon: "Don't try and tell me Green Day are punk. They're not. They're plonk, and they're bandwagoning on something they didn't come up with themselves. I think they are phony." Much like all scenes, there are those who are more interested in enforcing rules about what is and isn't punk than helping the scene itself. Selling out isn't signing with a major because you want to reach more people with your music. It's making a record you're told to make rather than what you want to make. It's compromising on your vision in exchange for money, and in my view, Green Day and The Offspring never did that. Sum 41's lead guitarist Dave Baksh puts it beautifully. Something that was based on not having any rules has probably one of the strictest rulebooks in the world. The punk revival is an era of music that doesn't always get the critical love it should, leading to some people feeling a little bit embarrassed about their youthful obsession and that they've graduated to proper adult music now. But for a lot of people, me included, these bands were their formative experience of obsessing over music for the first time. Playing along to Green Day and The Offspring in my bedroom is how I first learnt to play guitar. Their songs pack an insatiable energy and emotional punch that meant they've connected deeply with teenage audiences over the past decades, and it's fun shout-along at the top of your lungs music. Pop punk nails choruses like no other genre. In 2016, Rolling Stone wrote that pop punk was still one of the most predominant and popular rock genres. Its popularity may have waxed and waned over the years, but it's now having a well-deserved resurgence. These bands promoted a do-it-yourself mentality, and they wrote killer songs too, so what's not to like? Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear what you think in the comments below. If you want the full story of the 90s punk explosion, I highly recommend Ian Winwood's brilliant book, Smash. Finn McKenty also runs a very entertaining channel called the Punk Rock MBA if you want to study further. And if you do enjoy what I do, then do consider supporting me on Patreon, where there is now a 7-day free trial. But as always, I'll be seeing you here very, very soon.